The latest edition of Wine2Wine takes place in Verona on the 25th and 26th of November 2019. I am super honoured to have been invited to appear on a panel discussing podcasts, audience growth, education and social sustainability, which I hope to broadcast here at a later date. As part of my preparation for that talk, I put together a special deck that sets out all of the podcast equipment that I use to produce Interpreting Wine. To see that, and I hope get you started on your podcasting journey, just head to interpretingwine.com/kit. This series was recorded at this year's Wine2Wine in Verona and will feature interviews with the key organisers, as well as selected speakers, bringing the experience of this major digital event and allowing you to feel a part of proceedings no matter where in the world you are. Today's episode of the Wine2Wine series features Singapore-based wine consultant Annette Scarfe, MW. Recorded at the Wine2Wine conference in Verona, where Annette was presenting on the topic of entering the Singapore market, we hear her origin story and development as an MW in Singapore. We get a deep dive into the Singapore drinking and wider culture, and she gives recommendations for entering the Singapore market. Enjoy.
My name's Annette Scarfe, Master of Wine in Singapore. I love my job. I love meeting people, chatting about things. I host masterclasses and events and dinners. But people always ask me how I got into wine, and it's a second career for me because I went to Singapore 23 years ago as a CFO of a bank, but I'd always had a love and a passion of wine, and I made the decision to leave that corporate world and sort of follow my passion in 2005, and I've been working in wine ever since then. So Singapore is, I think, a really interesting market. When I first went there was very little opportunity to taste different wine styles at all. Everything was very much dominated by Pernod Ricard and the big Australian brands. I mean, the Australian brands do still dominate. However, there's a really thriving wine scene there now. And that was really triggered by our casinos, the first one which was built and came live in 2010. The casinos brought Michelin-star restaurants bought sommeliers from all over Europe. Sommeliers from Europe were not interested in having a wine list that was just all driven by the major brands. So they started bringing in other wines, which was really the start of the increase. And then the other thing I see, I do a bit of WSET education in Singapore, and that has grown dramatically now. The trust, I got some figures from the WSET Trust before I came here, and they said that Singapore is now their 15th biggest market, which for a small country with only 5.8 million people in it, that's quite remarkable. But the other thing that's interesting about it is the people that come to me to learn are people who are bankers, lawyers, really people not necessarily working in the trade. And in fact, it's really non-trade consumers that are doing most of the wine education because they love wine, they drink wine, they want to learn more about wine. And we're in a bit of a strange situation there. I do some work with restaurants in the UK as well, and generally speaking, the UK wine trade is fairly well educated. They do know a lot about the product, but in Singapore, the consumer knows a lot more than the trade. It's a really interesting sort of thing. So, again, that's why I always tell people who are looking to get into the Singapore market to make sure that you really get a proper, credible importer there, because there's tons of hobbyist importers who know really very little about wine altogether. So that's really kind of me and what I do in Singapore. This is my first time here, actually, in Wine2Wine, and I think it's fascinating. It's a really great opportunity. Not just the sessions are fantastic anyway, but really more just networking and catching up with people. I've had some really good meetings over coffees and lunches, and so I think it's a really good forum for all of that.
It's my first time here, actually, at Wine2Wine. And yeah, it's been a fantastic session. I think the innovative way, really, that there isn't a tasting component. I think turning that on its head has really, put the seminars and put the people front and center. Of course, there is wine here. Of course, there's no Wine2Wine without wine. But yeah, I agree. I think it's just an excellent conference. I think it's an innovative way to actually educate and to reach the trade and I guess consumers as well. Back to Singapore. I think before we kind of get into talking about the session you were presenting here and really more about the opportunity on the business side of things, I don't know anything about Singapore really. I will freely admit that I've never been. And I imagine, I've got lots of listeners in the UK and the US. Maybe they haven't been over there either. And lots of producers are also in Europe who, again, potentially they haven't actually gone there. So, given your 23 years on the ground there, give us that kind of virtual tour of, what's it like there? Kind of, give us that insight of, the benefit of that experience.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, so Singapore, it has changed a lot in 23 years, but some things haven't changed at all. And the things that haven't changed is it's still an incredibly safe country. So people who've never ventured to Singapore and are a bit worried about doing their first trip for Asia, I always call Singapore Asia for beginners. And it's still very much the same case there. It's incredibly safe. We do still have some fairly draconian sentences, like we still have the death sentence, and I'm not going to get into a story about whether I believe in that or not, but generally speaking, it does mean it's a very, very safe country. Not that I do, but I could walk back at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and the only thing that might come out of the undergrowth is maybe a snake if I'm out in the woods. But it's not going to be sort of being attacked by something. Any sort of violence we have is always just domestic violence in there. It's an incredibly clean place, really, really clean. And it's a very innovative, terrific place to be. There's the buildings are fantastic. The infrastructure is fantastic, but it's full of the two things Singaporeans love to do, is to shop and to eat. And eating is a really, really massive sort of pastime for people. People will travel from one side of Singapore to the other just to get a particular bowl of chicken rice or a particular noodle dish, which I must admit I still find quite extraordinary, and it'd be quite the culture if you walked out at lunchtime and you saw people in the lunch break. They're happy to queue up for 40 minutes to get a dish of their favourite produce when there's somebody next door which is almost empty. And I think we don't have that same culture, that same Western culture. If I want a cup of coffee and I see there's a huge queue at one coffee shop, I'll just probably go to the next place and grab one and move on. So, but this is why the wine industry is interesting, because with the younger people, the 25 to 35, the 25 to 35 and the 35 to 45 are our biggest bracket of consumers. Interestingly, those 18 to 24 are really very, very small. So again, that's quite different from other places where as soon as people get to university, there's quite a young sort of generation. They're just not really the people consuming alcohol there. But this sort of younger bracket, their biggest queue for purchasing is a food and wine match. And so this is what I've seen, a real change in the culture. I go down to my family-run Chinese restaurant, and when I, sort of white Formica tables, ordering the food there, and when I first went there, when I first went there, if I wanted wine, I had to bring my own wine glasses. Otherwise, I'd be drinking wine in these plastic water cups that we have in front of us here. Now those restaurants have actually purchased glasses, and it's quite common for people to bring wine in. Wine is very much seen as something to share with Singaporeans. It's quite a different culture than you have in many other places. People would not tend, they'll buy wine to take away, but they buy it to take to a restaurant to have with food. People rarely would drink wine at home in the same way that we do in sort of more European countries. Yes, if you're going for dinner with someone, but they're just as happy, or they like to bring the wine out and share it with friends. So, you'll quite often see people going and say, I've got this fabulous wine that I brought back from wherever, Italy or Germany. And instead of saying, come round to my house and have it, they'll pick what we call a coffee shop, which is really like a little food place, and they'll take the wine there and you'll try it there. So that's why I think the whole thing with food and wine matching, I often think it's a mistake when countries focus so much on the food in their own native country. So I mean, I've seen all of these things: drink Argentinian Malbec with steak. Singaporeans might eat steak once or twice a year, maybe a bit more, but for a special birthday. So you're basically giving them the message then that I can only drink Malbec twice a year when I go out for those 2 steak meals. So I think what people need to do, and if they want to get into the market, is come and see us and just go round to all the local stalls and try the noodles, try the chicken fried rice, try the bakute, and then think about what wine would go with that. And then as soon as you've got the cue to go with a local dish, you're immediately increasing opportunities.
That really gets to the nub of it. When you look at how people are eating and how they're drinking and how that unfolds, you get so much insight. So, thank you for that. I think that actually, it does give a real deep insight and a few nods and a few helps to those Argentinians who might be trying to look at the Singaporean market. One question kind of is in my mind, though, about that kind of take a bottle to the restaurant and share it with your friends. I mean, are there kind of identifiable drivers of that? Is there something around licensing where I guess the BYO market, which is what I'm kind of picking up, that's bigger now, and they've got the glasses now, so you don't have to bring your own. But is it something on that side of things driving that, or is it you think a sort of a longer standing, I guess, cultural point just around sharing, and maybe it doesn't take place in people's homes in exactly the same way that it may do in the UK or in the US?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I mean, the Chinese culture generally, and we are predominantly Chinese, is really for BYO. That's often why Chinese restaurants which are licensed with a good list struggle sometimes to sell wine, because it's still very common for people to bring their very best wines to the restaurant. So a lot of these coffee shops that I'm talking about, or food courts, they're not licensed as such. They can sell beer, which requires a different license in Singapore. And so there is no worries about bringing your own wine or your own products there. The only thing that's changed in that now, in the time I've been there, is this new licensing law where you can't drink after 10:30 at night in public places. So 20-odd years ago, you could bring most of these food places, like the local one I was just talking about, that's open until 4 o'clock in the morning. And it's very common for people to go to the movies or go for dinner and then do something else and then come in for another snack later at 1 or 2 o'clock. And they would have always bought wine with them then if they had wine. Now that's not allowed anymore. And so, if you're going to bring wine to these places, it has to be consumed, and you can't sit outside after 10:30. But I think as well, they're not going back to the houses. Certainly when I first went there, it was very, very common for everyone to live with an extended family. And so if you were a 25 or 30-year-old, another reason you wouldn't really take people back to your house is you're quite likely to have either your other siblings' baby there as well, if they had children, and you'll have your parents there, and you might even have your grandparents there, all living in the same thing. So that's, I think, another driver why people would always go out and socialise with their friends outside, because there wasn't always a lot of space. Now, that is changing. There are more and more condos that are being built, So people do tend to have their own homes. But I think there really is just a really big sharing community. I mean, the view of wine and that from the consumers in Singapore, which I think is lovely, is that wine is really to be shared and wine is really to be enjoyed. I'm often quite surprised. I'll be running a wine course and then there'll be somebody there who will say something to me at the beginning like, I've been saving this bottle of wine for 7 or 8 years and when's the best time to drink it? Or they'll ask me about the wine. And then the next thing I know is on the last day of the course, they've bought this precious bottle in to share with the rest of their course mates, which I think is lovely, and it's just extraordinary because I think fundamentally, generally, with a more Western culture, I think we're perhaps a little bit more selfish than that. We might save that special bottle to have with 1 or 2 very special people around an occasion, but we wouldn't just think of necessarily always just taking it along just to have with people who are just sitting and learning about wine with us. So I think that's quite lovely.
Yeah, final question really from me, because I know you're dashing off to a fellow MW's presentation just now. There's always kind of loads happening here at Wine2Wine. But firstly, thank you so much. I think it's a real, novel for my listeners and for me to get this insight into the culture. I mean, interestingly, one of my takeaways is there's actually a couple of things you've alluded to there that are actually quite similar to the Spanish culture, which in mainland Europe is the one I'm closest to. You know, you can definitely in Madrid, you'll walk down the little back alleys and you'll see the one place that's absolutely heaving and literally standing room only, and then next door there'll be one man and his dog sort of thing. But then also I think in a lot of markets in the Mediterranean, I think Italy, they do very much think around, the food pairing, and it's potentially you're always going to have some food on the table there when you're having the wine, and the wine is designed to kind of go with the food. So super interesting for me. To finish, I just really invite you to draw out 1 or 2 of the key takeaways, the things that came out of your presentation here that you think, maybe somebody who's looking ahead, who's planning for next year, the next sort of 5 years, who maybe hasn't looked at Singapore, and what might you say to them to get them to consider or to take that first step? Okay, so the most important takeaway really is make sure that you get the right importer, because we've got over 400 people import wine into Singapore, and that's for a country our size. That's really quite an incredible number. But many are hobbyists, so they do their day jobs and then they just bring wine in. I mean, fundamentally, Singapore's GDP is really driven by import-export business, and so nearly everybody that you meet who's got their own business are some sort of, in inverted commas, businessman or businesswoman. And they've started appreciating wine, and they know they can bring wine in because it's very easy to get an import license. So they can't see any problem why, when they read about a Bordeaux that's best drunk after 10 or 15 years, they think they can sort of slip it in with their shipment of silk or with their shipment of machinery parts. And it's fine if it takes them 10 years to sell it, because they've got that wine will last for 10 years. But the most important thing is, of course, we're a country where we have a very tiny diurnal temperature range. So we vary from 30 degrees in the winter to 35 in the summer, and our day and night falls from, by about 3 or 4 degrees between the middle of the night and the middle of the day. So having the right importer, making sure that they're bringing your wine over in a reefer, making sure that when it arrives on the docks, it's going straight into air-conditioned warehouses is really absolutely critical. Otherwise, your wine is just going to be baked, within days of getting there. And then make sure you do some wine dinners or events, particularly if it's a new product in there, to get people interested in it. Find a match with the local food and host an event
show that that's actually happening. And I think that's the really the biggest keys for success there.
Thank you so much, Annette. This has been one that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I'm so happy we got the chance to sit down together at Wine2Wine. Do, of course, see below for Annette's contact details. And given that this is the 6th part of my 8-part series covering Wine2Wine 2019, if you have missed any other episodes of the series, do be sure to head to interpretingwine.com/Wine2Wine19. This will take you to a playlist that will contain all 8 episodes. Next time in the Wine2Wine series, in episode 348, I sit down with Paul Maybray, CEO at Emmetry. See you then.